December 12, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The temperature outside had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, but inside Recreation Hall B, the air was warm, almost stifling from the steam radiators that hissed gently along the walls. Corporal Takeshi Yamada sat in the third row of wooden chairs, his hands folded in his lap, his posture rigid with confusion and suspicion. Around him, 73 other Japanese prisoners of war waited in similar states of uncertainty, some whispering nervously to each other, most sitting in tense silence. At the front of the hall, an American soldier was threading film through a projector. The machine clicked and whirred as he worked, a sound that felt both mechanical and somehow magical to men who had spent the last year expecting death, torture, or at minimum, brutal imprisonment. Instead, they had been fed better than they'd eaten as soldiers, given medical care that exceeded what Japanese military hospitals provided their own wounded. And now, impossibly, they were being invited to watch a movie. Yamada had been a soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army for 3 years. He had fought in the Philippines, survived the brutal campaigns that had killed most of his unit, and finally been captured on Leyte in October 1944 after being knocked unconscious by American artillery. When he woke in an American field hospital, he had assumed he would be executed once his usefulness as an intelligence source was exhausted. That was what Japanese military doctrine taught would happen to prisoners. That was what every soldier believed. Instead, he had been treated for his wounds, given clean clothes, fed 3 meals a day, and eventually shipped to America, to this place called Wisconsin, where the cold was more severe than anything he'd experienced, but the barracks were heated. Where the guards carried rifles but rarely seemed hostile, where everything contradicted the certainty he had carried into battle. And now, a movie, an American film shown to enemy prisoners for entertainment. No propaganda purpose that Yamada could discern, no interrogation attached, just entertainment for enemies who had been trying to kill Americans months earlier. The lights dimmed. The projector came to life, throwing a beam of light onto the white screen at the front of the hall. And as the opening credits of Going My Way began to roll, accompanied by Bing Crosby's voice singing, Takeshi Yamada felt something inside him crack, not with despair, but with the terrible recognition that everything he had been taught about his enemies was wrong. This is the story of how movie nights in American POW camps accomplished what battlefield victories could not. How Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe Americans were racially inferior and spiritually weak, discovered instead a civilization so confident in its values that it extended culture and dignity even to those who had sworn to destroy it. How this simple act of showing films to prisoners became the most devastating psychological weapon America wielded. And how 74 men sitting in a Wisconsin recreation hall in December 1944 began the transformation that would help reshape post-war Japan. Sometimes the most powerful victories are won not with weapons, but with humanity that the enemy never expected.
To understand what that movie night meant to Japanese prisoners, you must first understand what surrender meant in Imperial Japanese military culture. It wasn't just shameful, it was unthinkable. A violation of everything a Japanese soldier was taught from his first day of training. The Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, issued by Emperor Meiji in 1882 and drilled into every recruit, was explicit. Duty to the emperor superseded life itself. The military code, as interpreted and enforced by the Imperial Japanese Army, offered only 2 honorable outcomes: victory or death. There was no third option. Surrender was worse than death. It was eternal disgrace that stained not just the soldier, but his entire family for generations. Japanese soldiers were taught that capture meant torture and execution, that Americans and their allies committed systematic atrocities against prisoners, that the only rational response to impending capture was suicide, by grenade, by bayonet, by charging into enemy fire. Anything but the shame of surrendering. This indoctrination was so complete that of the approximately 5.1 million Japanese soldiers who served during World War II, only about 50,000 were captured alive by Allied forces during the war's first 4 years, a capture rate of roughly 1%. The other soldiers who didn't return home died fighting, committed suicide, or died from disease and starvation, but they didn't surrender. Corporal Takeshi Yamada had fully internalized this code. He carried a hand grenade specifically designated for suicide if capture became inevitable. He had written farewell letters to his family before each major engagement, assuming each battle might be his last, and wanting his death to serve the emperor with honor. The concept of becoming a prisoner had never been presented to him as a possibility, only as a failure so complete that death was preferable. His capture in October 1944 on Leyte occurred only because he was unconscious when American soldiers found him. An artillery shell had exploded close enough to knock him senseless, but not close enough to kill him outright. He woke in an American aid station, wounded but alive, surrounded by enemy soldiers, his suicide grenade gone, his chance for honorable death stolen by circumstances beyond his control. His first conscious thought was shame so profound it felt physical. His second thought was certainty that torture would begin soon. He had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that they violated the laws of war routinely, that captured Japanese soldiers could expect mutilation, starvation, and eventual execution after whatever intelligence value they possessed had been extracted. Instead, an American medic gave him water, treated his wounds, administered morphine for pain, spoke to him through a Japanese-American translator with professional courtesy rather than hatred. The cognitive dissonance was so severe that Yamada spent his first 3 days of captivity in what the American psychiatrist who examined him later described as dissociative shock. He performed basic functions, eating, sleeping, following instructions, but seemed mentally absent, unable to process the contradiction between expectation and reality. He was not alone. Of the approximately 5,400 Japanese prisoners held in camps across the United States by late 1944, the majority had experienced similar psychological crises upon capture. They had prepared themselves for death, not for professional medical care followed by adequate food and shelter. The gap between what they expected and what they experienced was so vast that many prisoners initially believed it was an elaborate deception, that the real brutality would reveal itself eventually. The journey from battlefield to American prison camp took approximately 6 weeks for Yamada. He was processed through several temporary facilities in the Pacific Theater, each one contradicting his expectations. Medical examinations that were thorough but not invasive or humiliating, interrogations that were professional rather than torturous, food that exceeded Japanese military rations in both quality and quantity. The sea voyage from the Philippines to San Francisco took 3 weeks aboard a troop ship returning from the Pacific. Japanese prisoners occupied one section of the vessel, guarded but adequately cared for. They received the same rations as American soldiers aboard ship, meals that most Japanese prisoners found almost incomprehensibly abundant. Private First Class Hideo Tanaka, captured alongside Yamada on Leyte, kept a secret diary of the journey despite regulations prohibiting it. The diary, discovered decades later and donated to the National Archives, provides one of the few first-person Japanese accounts of the POW experience in America. His entry from the sea voyage reads, November 3, 1944, 5th day at sea. The Americans continued to feed us better than we ate as soldiers, meat at every meal, fresh bread, coffee with sugar. I wait for the deception to end, for the real treatment to begin. But each day is the same. Adequate food, no beatings, no torture. Either this is the most elaborate psychological warfare campaign imaginable, or everything we were taught about American barbarity was false.
I don't know which possibility frightens me more.
The American coastline appeared on the horizon on November 18, 1944. Japanese prisoners crowded whatever viewing points they could access, staring at a nation they had been taught was weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse. What they saw instead was San Francisco Bay, a harbor so vast and so crowded with ships that it seemed to mock everything Japanese propaganda had claimed about American industrial weakness. Yamada counted 43 cargo vessels in various stages of loading or unloading, each ship larger than anything in the Japanese merchant fleet. Cranes moving continuously, electric and powerful, lifting cargo that would have required hundreds of laborers in Japan. The scale of operations visible from the harbor dwarfed anything he had witnessed in Japanese ports. "We have already lost," Tanaka wrote in his diary that night. "We lost before the war began. You cannot defeat this. You cannot defeat a nation that has so much it can afford to treat prisoners well while simultaneously producing enough to fight on two fronts. We were sent to fight with bamboo spears against industrial empire." From San Francisco, the prisoners traveled by train to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The 3-day rail journey provided the first comprehensive look at American territory for soldiers who had been taught that America was exhausted, divided, and on the brink of collapse from the strain of total war. Instead, they witnessed abundance that seemed impossible. Farmlands stretching to horizons, each farm larger than entire Japanese villages. Towns with electric lights blazing at night as if there were no war at all. Factories operating around the clock, their lit windows visible for miles. Civilian automobiles everywhere, parking lots full of them. Ordinary Americans driving their own vehicles as if personal car ownership was normal, rather than the privilege of the wealthy elite. Yamada pressed his face against the train window, watching America pass, calculating, comparing, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he had been taught. The mathematics were devastating. If one American farm produced more than 10 Japanese farms, if American workers owned cars while Japanese workers walked, if American factories operated at this scale, then Japan's war aims were not just difficult, but impossible. The train passed through industrial zones where a single factory complex dwarfed entire Japanese manufacturing districts. They saw workers changing shifts, thousands of them, many of them women, driving to work in their own cars. This casual deployment of resources, women in factories, cars for workers, electricity burning continuously, spoke to productive capacity beyond Japanese comprehension.
The propaganda was worse than lies, Tanaka wrote. Lies can be exposed with evidence. What we were told was fantasy. We were told America was weak, divided, on the verge of collapse. What I see through this train window is the richest, most powerful nation on Earth, so strong it can afford to waste more than we can produce. And we declared war on this. The arrogance, the delusion, the criminal stupidity of our leaders who sent us to fight this war, it overwhelms me. November 22nd, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Takeshi Yamada and 73 other Japanese prisoners arrived at a facility that defied every expectation they had carried about imprisonment. The camp sprawled across several hundred acres of Wisconsin forest. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, each building constructed with more lumber than most Japanese villages possessed. Every structure was wired for electricity that flowed continuously, never rationed, never cut. Steam heat kept the buildings warm despite temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing. Plumbing provided hot water for showers, not cold water rationed and distributed, but hot water on demand, a luxury that most Japanese soldiers had never experienced even as free men. The prisoners were processed with efficiency that exceeded anything the Imperial Japanese Army had achieved at the height of its power.
Identification photographs taken, medical examinations conducted by actual doctors with real medical equipment, dental care provided. Several prisoners received their first professional dental treatment ever, as American military dentists filled cavities and extracted infected teeth without charge or hesitation. They were issued uniforms, clean and new, with PW stenciled on the back, but otherwise identical to American military clothing. They received boots that fit properly, something most Japanese soldiers had never experienced. They were assigned bunks in heated barracks that housed 20 men each, a population density that felt almost luxurious compared to the cramped conditions Japanese soldiers had endured. But the real shock came at dinner the first night. The mess hall could accommodate 200 prisoners at a time, long tables with benches, a serving line where kitchen staff, both American soldiers and Japanese prisoners assigned to kitchen duty, filled each man's tray with portions that seemed absurd. Rice, real white rice, not the mixture of rice and barley that Japanese soldiers had received when supplies allowed. Meat, beef stew with vegetables, bread, butter, milk, coffee, dessert, apple pie, warm with a texture and sweetness that most Japanese prisoners had never tasted. Yamada stared at his tray, convinced there had been a mistake. This was more food than he had received in a week during the final months in the Philippines. This was more food than he had eaten as a civilian in Japan before the war. And this was supposed to be one meal for prisoners, for enemies. Corporal Kenji Sato, who had been captured on Saipan earlier in 1944 and therefore had more experience with American captivity, leaned over and said quietly, "Eat it. This is normal. Every meal. 3 times a day. I have been here 4 months. The food never stops. I have gained 15 pounds." Yamada ate slowly, waiting for nausea or sickness, expecting the food to be tainted or his starved system to reject such abundance. Neither happened. The food was real, safe, and better than anything he remembered eating.
That night, lying in a bunk with a real mattress, warm under wool blankets, in a building heated against Wisconsin winter, Yamada experienced a psychological crisis that American camp psychiatrists would later categorize as ideological collapse syndrome. Everything he believed was being systematically disproven by direct experience. He wasn't being tortured. He wasn't starving. He was, by objective measure, living better as a prisoner than he had lived as a soldier serving the emperor. The implications were devastating. If Americans treated prisoners this well, then Japanese propaganda about American barbarity was false. If American propaganda was false about prisoner treatment, what else was false? If Americans had resources to feed prisoners abundantly while fighting a global war, then Japanese claims about American weakness were false. If all of this was false, then what had he been fighting for? Camp McCoy operated under strict Geneva Convention protocols, administered by American officers who took prisoner welfare seriously, not just as a legal obligation, but as strategic policy. The camp commander, Colonel Michael Stevens, believed that well-treated prisoners were more cooperative, that humane conditions served American interests by demonstrating moral superiority over Japanese military doctrine, and that post-war reconstruction of Japan would benefit from prisoners who returned home with first-hand experience of American values. The daily routine at Camp McCoy was structured but not harsh. Morning roll call at 7 a.m., breakfast at 7:30, work assignments for those prisoners who chose to work, and work was optional for enlisted men, though officers were prohibited from working under Geneva Convention rules. Lunch at noon, afternoon work or recreation, dinner at 6 p.m., free time in the evenings until lights out at 10 p.m. Prisoners who chose to work received wages, 80 cents per day in scrip that could be spent at the canteen. The canteen stocked cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other comfort items at prices subsidized to ensure prisoners could afford them. The concept of paying enemy prisoners for their labor seemed insane to men from a military culture where even Japanese soldiers were barely compensated. The work itself was not strenuous. Under Geneva Convention restrictions, prisoners could not be used for war production, so Camp McCoy assignments involved agricultural work, camp maintenance, and food processing for the camp's own needs. Japanese prisoners worked in camp gardens growing vegetables, in the mess hall preparing meals, in maintenance crews keeping buildings repaired, in the laundry washing uniforms. The work was supervised but not harsh. American guards generally treated prisoners with professional courtesy. Some guards were hostile. They had lost friends or family members to Japanese forces, and their resentment was understandable and sometimes visible. But institutional policy demanded correct treatment, and most guards followed policy even when personal feelings might have dictated otherwise. Private Tanaka, assigned to work in the camp garden, wrote in his diary, November 28, 1944, I work today growing vegetables that will feed us, the prisoners. The American guard supervising us, Sergeant Morrison, shared his cigarettes during break. He told us about his farm in Iowa through the translator. He showed us photographs of his wife and children. He treated us like people, not slaves, not even really prisoners, just men doing a job. When I compare this to how our military treated Korean laborers, to how we treated Chinese civilians, the contrast is unbearable. We were taught we were superior, but we behaved like barbarians, and our enemies behave with honor.
Medical care at Camp McCoy exceeded what most Japanese soldiers had ever received. The camp hospital had X-ray equipment, surgical facilities, pharmaceutical supplies, including antibiotics, that Japanese military medicine had never possessed in adequate quantities. Prisoners with chronic conditions received treatment. Those who had been wounded were given physical therapy to restore function. Yamada, who had shrapnel wounds that had healed poorly during the months of combat in the Philippines, received surgery to remove embedded metal and proper wound care that eliminated the chronic infection he had learned to live with. The American surgeon, Captain David Goldman, explained each step of the procedure through a translator, answered Yamada's questions patiently, and checked on him daily during recovery. "Why do you care if enemy soldiers heal properly?" Yamada asked through the translator during one checkup. Captain Goldman, whose brother had been killed at Guadalcanal fighting against Japanese forces, answered, "Because you're a patient. That's what matters right now. When you're healed, you're still a prisoner. But while you're in my hospital, you're a patient, and patients deserve good medical care. It's not complicated." But it was complicated. It was profoundly complicated for men whose entire worldview was constructed on hierarchy, racial superiority, and the subordination of individual humanity to national purpose. American individualism, which Japanese propaganda had derided as weakness and lack of discipline, produced a system where even enemy prisoners were treated as individuals deserving basic dignity. By December 1944, Camp McCoy housed approximately 400 Japanese prisoners, making it one of the smaller specialized camps. The population was intentionally kept modest because Japanese prisoners, unlike German or Italian prisoners, required more careful management due to language barriers, cultural differences, and the intensity of their military indoctrination. The camp administration made efforts to accommodate Japanese cultural practices where possible. Prisoners were allowed to observe traditional holidays. They could practice Buddhism without interference. They could write letters home through the Red Cross, though mail service to Japan was sporadic and unreliable given the continuing war. The camp library included books in Japanese, novels, histories, some technical manuals. Prisoners could check out books freely. They could play traditional games like Go or Shogi. They could form musical groups or practice martial arts as exercise. The Americans, it seemed, were not interested in crushing Japanese culture, only in confining Japanese soldiers. This tolerance of cultural practice, combined with material comfort that exceeded what prisoners had known as soldiers, created profound psychological dissonance.
If the Americans were racially superior, as Japanese propaganda claimed, why did they show such respect for Japanese culture? If Americans were culturally primitive, why did they have libraries and encourage education? If Americans were weak and undisciplined, how did they maintain such efficient organization while also allowing individual expression? These questions had no good answers within the framework of Japanese military ideology. The only resolution was to accept that the framework itself was wrong, that everything they had been taught was, at minimum, grossly distorted and possibly entirely fabricated to serve purposes that had nothing to do with truth. This process of ideological collapse occurred gradually through accumulated experiences rather than sudden revelation. Each meal that arrived on schedule, each medical treatment provided without hesitation, each interaction with American guards who treated prisoners like humans rather than subhumans, each demonstration of American prosperity and organizational capacity, each piece of evidence that contradicted propaganda required mental accommodation, and eventually the accumulated weight of contradiction collapsed certainty. By early December 1944, Yamada and many other prisoners had reached a state of profound confusion. They weren't ready to embrace American values or reject Japanese identity, but they were beginning to question the specific teachings that had sent them to war. They were beginning to recognize that their enemies were not demons, that American civilization was not weak or decadent, and that the war they had fought was not the righteous struggle for survival they had been told it was. And then came the movie night. December 10th, 1944. The announcement was posted in Japanese on the bulletin board in the main barracks. Film screening, Tuesday evening, December 12th, 7 p.m., Recreation Hall B. American film with Japanese subtitles. Attendance optional but encouraged. Hot chocolate will be served. Takeshi Yamada read the announcement 3 times, trying to understand. A movie. Entertainment for prisoners of war? With refreshments? The concept seemed surreal. In Japanese military culture, entertainment for common soldiers was minimal, perhaps some patriotic songs, occasional theatrical performances with heavy propaganda content. Movies were rare and generally served ideological purposes. The idea that an enemy nation would show films to captured soldiers for no apparent purpose beyond entertainment made no sense.
It's psychological warfare, insisted Corporal Ichiro Matsuda, one of the more resistant prisoners, who maintained that American treatment was an elaborate deception. They will show us propaganda. They will try to break our spirit and turn us against Japan. We should refuse to attend. Attending is collaboration. But Private Tanaka, who had been corresponding with his family through the Red Cross and had received one letter back confirming they knew he was alive and held in America, disagreed. Everything here is psychological warfare by that logic. The food, the heat, the medical care, all of it designed to make us question our teachings. And it's working, Matsuda-san. Not because it's deceptive, but because it's real. Americans really do live this way. They really do treat prisoners this well. Refusing to watch a movie doesn't change that truth. The debate consumed the barracks for 2 days. Some prisoners vowed to boycott the screening as a matter of honor. Others were curious despite themselves. Most fell somewhere in the middle, uncertain, conflicted, wanting to understand what Americans hoped to accomplish with this gesture, but suspicious of hidden purposes. Yamada found himself in the curious category. He had been a soldier, not a zealot. He had served because Japanese men served, because the alternative was unthinkable social shame, because it was expected. But he had never been particularly ideological, and 3 months of captivity had already shaken much of his certainty about American barbarism and Japanese superiority. A movie seemed harmless, and if it was propaganda, well, he had been consuming propaganda his entire life. At least American propaganda might be interesting for its novelty. December 12, 1944. At 6:45 p.m., prisoners began filing into Recreation Hall B. The hall was warm, heated against the Wisconsin winter. Rows of wooden chairs had been set up facing a screen at the front. An American soldier operated a projector at the back of the room. Another soldier stood by a table with a large pot of hot chocolate and stacks of cups. Yamada entered with Tanaka and several other prisoners from his barracks. They chose seats in the middle section, not too close to the Americans, but not in the back with those prisoners whose body language radiated hostility and resistance. 74 Japanese prisoners eventually filled the hall. Not all 400 prisoners from the camp. Many had chosen to boycott, but enough to fill most of the seats, creating an audience that ranged from genuinely curious to deeply suspicious. Colonel Stevens stood at the front of the hall as prisoners settled. Through a translator, he explained, "Gentlemen, tonight we're showing Going My Way, an American film released earlier this year. It's about a Catholic priest in New York City who helps a struggling church and its community. There's no war content. It's not propaganda. It's simply a story, the kind of film Americans watch for entertainment. We thought you might enjoy seeing something of American culture beyond this camp. Hot chocolate is available at the back. Please help yourselves. Enjoy the film."
He sat down. The lights dimmed, and the projector whirred to life. The opening credits rolled. Bing Crosby's voice filled the hall, singing "The Day After Forever." The sound was clear, rich. The camp had invested in good audio equipment for these screenings. Subtitles in Japanese appeared at the bottom of the screen, translations provided by Japanese-American translators working for the War Department. For the first 10 minutes, Yamada watched with analytical distance. He noted the production quality, far superior to Japanese films he had seen. He observed the casual wealth visible in every scene, the costumes, the sets, the automobiles. He registered the story's premise: a young priest sent to help an older, struggling priest at a Catholic church in a working-class New York neighborhood. But somewhere around the 15-minute mark, something shifted. The story began to work on him. The characters felt real, flawed, struggling, human. Father O'Malley, played by Crosby, wasn't a propaganda hero spouting patriotic slogans. He was a person trying to help other people, using humor and patience and music to solve problems. The film showed Americans arguing with each other, struggling with poverty, dealing with generational conflict, working through personal failures. It showed Catholic immigrants, Irish and Italian communities, ethnic diversity coexisting in one city. It showed a society comfortable enough with its own flaws to depict them in popular entertainment. This was not the America of Japanese propaganda, not the America of racial purity and military discipline. This was messy, diverse, individualistic, surprisingly honest about its own problems, and somehow functional despite all that complexity. Around Yamada, other prisoners were having similar experiences. Some watched with visible skepticism, arms crossed, determined not to be moved. But others leaned forward, absorbed in the story. A few laughed at the film's gentle humor. Several wiped their eyes during the emotional scenes near the end. Private Tanaka, sitting next to Yamada, whispered, "This is what they watch? For fun? Stories about priests and neighborhood problems and singing? Not military glory? Not propaganda about national destiny?" "Apparently," Yamada whispered back. The film's climax involved Father O'Malley arranging for the elderly priest, Father Fitzgibbon, to be reunited with his mother, whom he hadn't seen in 45 years. The scene of their reunion, the old priest seeing his aged mother, both of them crying, embracing after decades apart, hit the Japanese prisoners with unexpected emotional force.